It might be the middle of November, but we still got a lot of trade talk to discuss. Elliotte Friedman just put out his first written 32 thoughts of the NHL season, and there's a lot of juicy details here to talk about. But what are the biggest updates trade-wise around the NHL, and what trades could we see in the next few months? Well, make sure you watch till the end as we go through all the trade rumors and all the latest trade talk, and hit that subscribe button if you're new for more hockey content just like this all throughout the year. We're just going to jump straight into it with a headline talking about how the Bruins and why they fired Jim Montgomery. We already talked about that quite a bit, about a potential firing of Jim Montgomery a couple days back, if you guys want to check out my thoughts on that. But there's a lot more in this article that I found fascinating. Now, up until this point, we actually hadn't gotten 32 written thoughts. It would be around 20 or 25 or so. But now with the NHL really heating up, especially trade-wise, we got a lot more to talk about. Now, the first trade segment in this article talks about the Boston Bruins and kind of gives us some updates on some of the players we talked about a couple weeks back, saying it's not a surprise, but we're already hearing that forwards with an edge will be coveted by contenders. So when the Bruins are being scouted, that's Trent Frederic. Obviously, as yet to be determined, contract status looms large. There was some talk about Morgan Geekie, but that may have been when he was out of the lineup. Teams generally understand that if someone is in the final season of his contract and is not in their plans, that they should find that player another situation. And specifically with Frederic, we talked about him before, but he, of course, makes $2.3 million, but he's going to be a UFA after this year, and a pretty young one at that. He's somebody, though, that I think has a lot of potential that just has not been seized this year with the Bruins. He's absolutely underperformed this year, but you could say that about pretty much 75% of that Bruins roster. But at 26 years old, he's somebody that had a breakout season last year, getting 18 goals, 40 points in 82 games. He's somebody that I think with that edge, with the opportunistic style he has a lot of potential to be a middle six scorer. Sure, this has been a down year on a pretty historic end, just 6 points in 20 games, but man, I still think there is something there with the package and the tools that are there still. He's 26 years old, so he should be in the prime of his career, but considering the player he is, I think still patience is needed. But with Freddie's cap hit being so low at just $2.3 million, that makes him pretty easy to move. And I think for a team like the Bruins, who's looking to shake things up, it would make sense for them to move him, especially with how much of a lack of a fit it seems like he is. Even with that edge and the physical style that Boston loves, it just hasn't really felt like a fit so far. Maybe the Bruins are going to be preaching a little bit more patience with him, considering they just fired their head coach and, of course, are bringing in a new one here. But I think for the Bruins, if this continues to slide, if Freddie over these next couple months continues to stagnate, I could absolutely see a deal happening. This won't be the last time I mention them in today's video, but I think Buffalo is one to watch, specifically with how much we've heard they've been active in the trade market, how much they're looking to improve. The lineup looks a little bit rough now with Tage Thompson out of the lineup due to injury, but once he's back, it looks a little bit better. Still, I think you could absolutely have Trent Frederic on that right side in the case of a Sam Lafferty, where you have him on that second line. I could easily see something like that, especially with the struggles that we've seen out of Jack Quinn. To me, I think we could see Frederic come in immediately into that spot. But I think considering the position the Sabres are in, I think they could absolutely use some more grittiness, especially in that middle six. And I think size is something that the Sabres are looking to improve upon, specifically on the back end, but I don't think it would hurt to add that into the top six either. Personally, for me, I think the Sabres would be prioritizing a defensive add, especially into that top four, to hopefully replace Jokiharju, who just doesn't seem to be it for the Sabres defense, but I don't think they'd be avoiding a forward addition either, especially to upgrade that middle six. To me, that would be the priority. Let me know down below for you guys. Do you want your favorite team to trade for Frederic? I think there's a lot of potential there still as a middle six scorer, but we'll have to wait and see. Considering his position right now, how slow of a start he's had too, I think the value would be pretty low and a team could get a pretty good player here still. Now, we're only into the third thought of this article, but already we're getting pretty crazy because we're not just talking about Trent Frederic of Boston. Apparently, we're also talking about Nikita Zadorov. As Elliotte Friedman says, weird idea that may only make sense to me. Nikita Zadorov back to Vancouver. No idea if even possible or if anybody would want it, but he was a good fit and the Canucks miss him. Now, this is what I like to call the patented monthly crazy Elliotte Friedman story, because I don't think there's anything to this, but the idea would be pretty interesting. Of course, we had Nikita Zadorov sign that mega contract with the Bruins this offseason, a deal that a lot of people, including me, lambasted quite a bit. He's making big money at a long term and was coming into that defense in a major way. But you could see this year, I mean, obviously the production is never going to be there for a player like Zadorov, but the fit hasn't really been at a great level. There's been some good moments, but he's had some growing pains getting adjusted to that Bruins system. Another player that maybe could benefit from the coaching change, perhaps, but of course he just came into there, so I don't think it would make too much of a difference. But we saw how just pivotal he was for Vancouver, especially in the playoffs last year. Had some big moments, some big goals, 4 goals, 8 points in 13 games. It was kind of unbelievable just how good of a playoff player he was. I don't think it could work, especially with the cap and the contract that Zadorov signed. There's a reason why Vancouver let him go into free agency, but him being back in the Canucks would be best for Zadorov, I think. The most likely situation, though, is that Zadorov and his anger contract is stuck with the Bruins, and I think that's the reality that Boston's going to have to manage. Now we keep going, and the next segment here talks about Morgan Frost, who seems to have been in trade rumors now for the last couple of years, really. There's been times where he is really not fit in John Tortorella's system, and then there's times where it seems like he's gotten past that, and he has a great relationship with him, and he's finally getting the minutes that he deserves. This year has kind of been the same exact situation, where he's been off and on, and it seems like that's a situation that isn't really benefiting Frost in the end. But as Elliotte Friedman mentions, player team that seem a match, Morgan Frost and Chicago. Frost didn't play Wednesday against Carolina, the 4th game of the last 5 he's watched from the press box. He's not a complainer, prefers to keep any displeasure behind closed doors, but players want to play. Obviously, any dance needs partners who deal, but the Blackhawks, in dire need of centers, are one team that makes sense for. Now, this is an interesting one because Frost has been in trade rumors for a while now, but we finally get a team that could be linked to him in Chicago, as Elliotte Friedman will later mention, and we'll get into that about Chicago's needs going forward. But in Frost's case, he's somebody that I think could be interesting in that Chicago forward group, but I think considering what Chicago needs going forward, I'm not sure if he's the exact type of player they need. He's a skill-first, creative centerman, but the reason why we've seen so many scratches and so many ups and downs in his career with Tortorella is because of the style he plays. He's never going to be this unbelievable physical defensive player, and that's a reason why we see Frost constantly scratched. When you have those mistakes, when you have those constant errors, you're going to have a coach like John Tortorella who's not going to be able to trust you, and we've seen that time and time again with Frost. But I just look at that Chicago forward group, and yes, they are in need of centermen. You could absolutely see that. Nick Foligno right now is their second-line centerman, but at what cost would Frost really bring, and how worth it would it actually be? For a Chicago team that has its major defensive woes and issues, especially going forward, bringing in another skill-first guy, I just don't really think is the answer. I think Chicago needs to be extremely careful right now with how they go forward, because yes, the improvement has not been there this season, but I don't think it's the end of the world if that's the case. One, you get a better pick, and especially with how loaded the top 4, top 5 of this draft is, I don't think that's necessarily a problem for Chicago, especially if it's a player like Porter Martone, who is the perfect fit for this Blackhawks team. But if you trade for players like Morgan Frost, what does that signal about the future? I mean, I think for Chicago, they really need to add balance into this roster, and Frost isn't exactly the player to do that. A team like Nashville makes a lot more sense to me for Frost, a team that could use some offensive juice and has struggled mightily this year. And Elliotte will also touch on Nashville as well in a little bit. But I think when it comes to the Preds, they could be a much better fit for Frost because obviously they are a contender and I think could use the best of what Frost has to offer. I think he could immediately come into that second line center position and do some good things for them there, especially to change his scenery. Chicago, I think, could be interesting, but I think Nashville is the real fit here for Frost. Speaking of Nashville, the next thought is about them, saying that they have 3 first-round picks in 2025. Tampa Bay and Vegas, in addition to their own, are coveted by teams that they talk to, but Barry Trotz so far shows no indication to move them. In addition to a center, he's also looking for a top 4 defender with a bit of term. I mean, a center and a top 4D, aren't we all looking for that? And then he goes on to say the teams that are looking hard at centers now, including Chicago and Nashville, have to wait when others wait into the market. One of those will be Toronto for sure. The Blackhawks and Preds have the advantage of high cap space and high picks to trade, and more willingness to do it at this time. But as the season continues and cap-strapped teams try to build space, competition will increase. So it seems like there's a bit of a fire under the butts of these teams like Chicago and Nashville to get a trade done, even a team like Buffalo who wants to have that success going forward. Nashville and Buffalo, I think especially, have the most pressure on them to get a deal done within this season, within 2024. I mean, especially a team like Nashville, who has just been so horrendous to start out this year, so unlucky too, could really use some juice that they aren't getting right now. Now we have some more information on the center market, which apparently has a lot of options right now. Elliotte Friedman talks about Christian Dvorak, a player that also, like Frost, has seemingly been in trade rumors forever now. But what's made a Dvorak trade even more likely this season, even with another struggling start to the year, is the fact that he is now a rental. His contract is pretty rough with a 4.45 cap hit, but the fact that he has no more term after this, I think, makes him a lot more enticing for other teams that still view the pedigree and I guess some of the face-off ability as pretty valuable. Now, in case Christian Dvorak is just holding something back with the Habs and immediately gets better on a different team, I don't think he's my answer if I'm looking at a trade whatsoever. I mean, the cap hit, of course, is a major factor, and unless you have just an exorbitant amount of cap space, you might have to retain, which I don't think is something I want to do on a Christian Dvorak type deal. But of course, as a centerman right now for Montreal, the results just have not been there. It seems like consistently Dvorak is just kind of a guy for Montreal. I mean, that's just seems like the year after year theme, where you want so much more out of this guy. You want him to be the supreme defensive player. You want him to bring more of that offense. He never really seems to do that. He's always just pretty average across the board. And whenever you watch him, you're like, is this guy even an NHL player? It doesn't even seem like it. You add on the fact that he hasn't played 70-plus games or more since 2020, constant injuries with Dvorak pretty much every single year, and this is just not the player that I would have to rely upon as a bottom six centerman. Sure, the faceoff ability is nice. I think he's rocking at 51% right now, which isn't bad or anything, but I think Dvorak is somebody that, yes, is a defensively minded centerman, but you're not really getting anything more than that. One of the only teams, especially if there's no salary retention, that you could maybe say makes sense is the Buffalo Sabres, but even then, I would go against that. I mean, you have a player like Peyton Krebs on their fourth line who has a similar amount of points as Dvorak. I think has 6 points on the year, but is younger, is cheaper, has a better face-off percentage. So what is the value for Buffalo trading for that type of player? Pedigree? That's pretty much it. So really, I think the big thing holding it back in Dvorak trade is just the fact that he's not a very good player at this stage, which really sucks for Montreal considering how much they traded for him in the first place. Now we go into a sentiment that I think will get a lot more interest in this market because I think he can actually play well, is Yanni Gourde of the Seattle Kraken. He's somebody that has also had a pretty poor start to this year and also is a UFA after this season. So there's a lot of talk around his future with Seattle and how it could fit out. But as Elliotte Friedman says, Yanni Gourde is an interesting one. His production is down, his ice time is down, but the Kraken organization loves him. Even as things haven't gone great for him, it hasn't diminished how they feel. Ultimately, both sides have to agree if this UFA to be marriage will continue, but at this time, there's no indication of a divorce. Now, just talking about it in the first place with Yanni Gourde is an interesting one. We've heard as well, very similarly talking about Gourde as well in a potential trade this year. I still think I'm leaning towards Gourde staying, but at the same time, if Seattle kind of goes in this mediocre direction throughout the rest of this year, Gourde is one of the Kraken's best potential trade chips, and I think especially towards trade deadline time as teams get desperate for centermen, I think Gourde could get underratedly a pretty good haul. And I think for teams especially looking for that playoff clutch gene, Yanni Gourde is one of the most clutch playoff players over the last decade or so, at least considering his role, always playing on a bottom six, always being likely the third line centerman. He's always been in that type of position. It's not really too much of a surprise to see his production decline considering just how all around that Seattle offense has been, but he's somebody I think you can always depend upon as a reliable middle six centerman. A lot of the same position, I guess you could say, as an Alex Wennberg type, but I think Gourde provides just more playoff experience and more playoff adaptability than him, and I think as a centerman could get quite a bit too. He's somebody that I don't think is going to be this revolutionary player for you, but exactly the type of depth add that could bring you wins come playoff time. People always look at him at his short size at 5'9" and just automatically assume he can't be that type of playoff player, but man, he is so gritty, so good along the boards, can do so much for you, can be so versatile. Of course, a two-time Stanley Cup champion, but just look at the playoff stats over the years. I mean, his last playoff appearance and run with Seattle back in 2023, he got 13 points in 14 games, but his time with Tampa and just how consistently good he was then shows what he is capable of. And I mean, for any team out there looking for a third-line center, Gourde would be it, not Dvorak. And sure, Gourde, I think, would cost way more, a different league than Dvorak would, but I think it's worth it. Now, it is worth noting that there is some trade protection in Gourde's case. He has a 22-team trade list, a list of teams that he would accept a trade to, so Seattle has to work within those perimeters. But at the same time, considering just how valuable Gourde can be, I don't think the teams available is going to be much of an issue. It'll more likely be the cap hit at $5.1 million. There might have to be some retention there for some teams to end up getting him, but again, I think it is absolutely worth it in the end. It's kind of hard for me for Seattle to really determine what I would do if I was them, considering I don't really know what their direction is. It seems like they're trying to be more competitive, so maybe in that aspect, they're a team that might want to keep Gourde in the end, considering how good of a leader I think he can be. But at the same time, I think considering what Gourde can get at the deadline, especially if it's upwards to a first-round pick, I think you got to pull the trigger on that. I mean, he's 32 years old, going to be turning 33 this December. You don't have much time left with him, at least in his prime offensive years, and we've already seen a bit of a decline as well in his play this season. So I think the writing is on the wall if I were Seattle, but this will be an interesting one to keep an eye on. One of the last trade-featured aspects of this article actually came from the Leafs, and it was a pretty fascinating excerpt talking about the goaltending situation for Toronto. And as Friedman writes, written before about how Toronto swatted away all requests for goalie Dennis Hildeby last season, season. North American newcomer Artur Akhmedov allowed 12 goals in his first 6 AHL games. Not too much of a surprise. He's pretty ridiculous. They're going to be asked about their plans at this position. Meanwhile, Nikita Zadorov made an impressive NHL debut Wednesday night. When he was sent down at the end of training camp, they knew he'd be coming back. Maybe not this quickly, but no one felt he needed too much time. Now, I didn't actually know about the trade interest surrounding Hildeby, but it's not really too much of a surprise. I mean, he's a gigantic goaltender, 6'2", or 6'7", 223 pounds, and as a former 4th rounder, he's progressed pretty well since 2022, especially in the AHL for the Marlies, putting up some great numbers over there. And this season, back and forth, I mean, it's caused him problems when he has played in the NHL, but I think there's still been some bright moments there, and still, a 910 save percentage in 4 AHL games is good to see. But I also was fascinated to see the shout out to Artur Akhmedov, who I think absolutely deserves it. He's been one of the more underrated goalie prospects for a while now. He was a 4th rounder back in 2022 or 2020 for the Leafs, and I loved that pick back then, and it's been looking great since then, having some great seasons over in Russia. This is the first year, though, where he's transitioned on to North America, and so far in 6 games for the Marlies, he's been incredible. A 195 goals against average, a 926 save percentage. Not exactly the most surprising thing in the world, but considering the underrated goalie crop the Leafs have coming up, that'll be something to watch out for, especially considering how good Stolarz and Woll has been for the Leafs. They have a nice goaltending setup coming up here, and that's a far cry from what we saw just a few seasons ago, really. The Leafs have really come a long way in their goalie development. Of course, Woll is a big one, but they have a couple other nice ones coming up too, and the Leafs are going to have a lot of goalie options, which I think is exactly what they needed. I would not be surprised if one of the teams that were interested in Hildeby, though, was the San Jose Sharks. We ultimately saw them trade for Yaroslav Askarov. They were obviously interested in AHL-ready goalie prospects around the league. Hildeby, though, is an interesting one, and we'll see how he progresses as he likely fits into the NHL as a backup, I would say, but a pretty good one at that, considering the size and the confidence that he provides. But that's going to be it for today for the latest NHL trade rumor breakdown. If you guys want to see the whole article and all the 32 thoughts, I'll link the whole thing down in the description down below so you guys can check it out. But I hope you guys did enjoy the latest breakdowns. If you guys did enjoy, of course, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit that notification bell. And comment down below your thoughts on all of these different guys, because there was a lot of players we talked about today in Frost, in Dvorak, in different players all across the league that could be dealt. And let me know if your team would be interested in any of those guys as well. Of course, share the video with all the hockey fans you guys know online as we lead up to the trade deadline this year. And click on this card for all my trade content right in one playlist. I'll see you guys in the next one, though, and have a fantastic hockey day. Goodbye.